Welcome to the debate. Have you ever watched a perfectly dubbed movie and you notice that the audio is just a fraction of a second out of sync with the actor's lips?
Oh yeah, it is incredibly jarring. Once you see it, you simply cannot unsee it.
Right. It's a tiny gap, maybe just milliseconds, but it creates this maddening, uncomfortable friction in your brain.
You are watching their mouth close, but the sound just keeps going.
Exactly. The illusion is broken and suddenly you just cannot focus on the story anymore. And for intermediate English learners, that exact friction is happening all day, every day, inside their own heads.
That is such a good way to frame it.
Today's debate stems from the recent source literature on second language acquisition, and we are looking specifically at this translation bottleneck. We are talking about intermediate learners who know the grammar, right? They have an extensive vocabulary, but they find themselves stuck in this relentless internal loop.
The translation loop.
Right. They hear a sentence, translate it into their native language, their L1, formulate a response, and then try to translate that response back into English, their L2.
And the tragedy of that loop is that, well, by the time that internal processing is done, the actual conversation has already moved on.
Yeah, the moment is gone.
The person they are talking to is just waiting. And it leads to hesitation, unnatural phrasing, and honestly, a tremendous amount of anxiety for the speaker.
Which brings us to the core of our discussion today. How does an intermediate learner actually break this habit? How do they transition to thinking directly in English? I argue that breaking this loop requires physical, behavioral habituation.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning it's about relying on daily output exercises. You have to force the mouth to train the brain. It is about building the literal muscle memory that bypasses the need to translate entirely.
And I come at it from a completely different way. Overcoming translation is fundamentally a cognitive restructuring task. It isn't just about moving your mouth more often or speaking faster.
You don't think output is the key?
No, I really don't. I think it requires learners to change exactly how they process input, how they map concepts directly to English, and frankly, how they manage their working memory capacity long before any output even begins.
Well, let me lay out why the behavioral approach is so essential for an intermediate student wanting to stop translating. Translation happens primarily because the brain simply isn't used to the physical and rhythmic flow of English.
Okay.
When a learner tries to speak and translate simultaneously, they are essentially trying to run a marathon without having ever jogged around the block. I propose that the cure lies in small, smart steps of daily output, specifically a technique called shadowing.
Shadowing being the immediate repetition of audio?
Precisely. This is where you repeat native speech immediately, like an echo. So you are listening to a podcast or watching a video, and you copy the speed, the rhythm, and the emotion in real time.
Without looking up words?
Right. Without stopping to check a dictionary or analyze the grammar, you are training your mouth and your brain to work together. And you combine that with narrating your daily life out loud in the simple present tense.
Like just talking to yourself?
Yeah, physically saying, I put on my shirt, or I drink my coffee, as you actually do those actions. This constant, low-stakes habit habituates the brain to produce the L2 on demand. Eventually, it makes the L1 translation process obsolete just through sheer physical repetition.
That is a compelling argument. But have you considered that output-driven methods often just reinforce what the literature calls hybrid processing?
Hybrid processing? What do you mean?
Yes, where you are using both languages simultaneously to get the job done. If the underlying mental architecture hasn't changed, you are just translating faster. You aren't actually stopping the translation.
I disagree, but go on.
I frame this problem as a direct overloading of Baddeley's working memory model.
Hold on. Before we go further, let's unpack Baddeley's model for a second for the listeners. Are you basically saying the brain only has so much RAM like a computer and translation eats it all up?
That is a perfect way to put it, actually. Working memory is your brain's short-term workspace. When a learner tries to hold a concept from their L1 native language, search their mental dictionary for the English vocabulary, and then apply English grammatical rules all at once, the cognitive cost is just too high.
The RAM maxes out.
Exactly. The system crashes. That crash is the hesitation you hear. To fix this, we have to look at Anderson's ACT star theory of learning.
Ah, the distinction between declarative and procedural knowledge.
Right. Think of declarative knowledge like reading a manual on how to ride a bike in your native language. You know the physics, you know where the pedals are, but procedural knowledge is the act of actually pedaling without falling over.
Sure.
Anderson's theory tells us intermediate learners are stuck reading the L2 manual in their L1 heads. To transition to procedural knowledge, you have to move from word-to-word translation to concept-to-meaning mapping. This means mastering perception and comprehension first.
So, completely abandoning the bilingual dictionary?
100%. You have to rewire the input before you can fix the output.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on how we actually get to that procedural knowledge, how we get them to, actually pedal the bike.
Okay, let's hear it.
You mentioned that working memory crashes because of the heavy cognitive load of juggling two languages. Shadowing is the exact mechanism that forces the brain to abandon that heavy load.
How so? If they don't know what they are saying, how does moving their mouth lower the cognitive load?
Because of the speed. When you are echoing a phrase like, "I want to speak English fluently," milliseconds after hearing it, there is simply no time to translate. It is a physical impossibility for your brain's RAM to process the L1 in that tiny window.
So you just force it out.
You force the L1 out of the equation entirely. Furthermore, it directly addresses Stephen Krashen's effective filter hypothesis. We know from the literature that anxiety builds a literal wall in the brain that blocks language acquisition.
Right, the effective filter.
Yeah. Shadowing lowers that filter because the learner starts treating English like music. You don't need to understand every single word of a song to sing along and internalize the melody, right?
I suppose not.
You focus on the physical feeling and the rhythm in your jaw and your throat. The meaning follows the physical familiarity.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. Output without deep perception is merely parroting. You can mimic the sounds of a language perfectly without your brain ever forming a semantic link to the actual meaning.
Well, I wouldn't call it parroting.
Before shadowing can be effective, learners must master what the models call perception, the very first step of linguistic processing.
Meaning their ability to just hear the sounds correctly?
Exactly. They need to be able to actually hear the difference between minimal pairs. Take the words ship and sheep. If your brain doesn't perceive the phonetic distinction, because that distinction doesn't exist in your native language, your mouth cannot accurately shadow it.
But they are still practicing the rhythm.
But you will think you are shadowing perfectly, while you are actually reinforcing an incorrect physical habit.
So what is the alternative to building the habit then?
Input flooding. This means listening to English podcasts at, say, 1.25 speed, strictly to train the ear to the rhythm and the phonology. Direct comprehension has to happen so that the brain intuitively expects certain English sounds to follow others.
I see.
That subconscious expectation is what eliminates the tiny pause where translation occurs. You don't fix the pause by just talking over it.
I'm really not convinced by that line of reasoning, because waiting for perfect perception creates a massive case of analysis paralysis for the intermediate learner.
Analysis paralysis?
Yes. You are asking them to sit quietly and listen at high speed until their brain perfectly maps the phonology. But that is not how humans acquire physical skills.
But language isn't purely a physical skill, though.
Speaking it is. Think about it like going to the gym. You don't sit on a bench and study the precise biomechanics of a push-up before you try one. Mispronounce sheep as ship early on stresses the system. It builds the physical neural pathways that transform English from a passive academic subject into your active inner speech.
Okay, but even if perception is imperfect, what kind of vocabulary are you actually building with that method? How is it stored?
What do you mean?
If we want to bypass translation, we have to look at the exact mechanism of vocabulary acquisition. You advocate for narrating daily life, which is fine in theory, but naming isolated nouns in your apartment is still a gateway to translation.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. The most effective way for intermediate learners to build vocabulary without the cognitive load of translation is environmental labeling.
Labeling things.
Right. When they wake up, they look around and physically name 5 things in the room: window, door, phone. And more importantly, they use circumlocution for the gaps.
Circumlocution? You mean talking around the word?
Yes, exactly. Imagine an intermediate learner walks outside and forgets the word garage. The instinct is to pull out the phone and translate the L1 word for garage into English. Circumlocution means they actively resist that urge.
So what do they do instead?
They physically point at the building and say out loud, "The place inside where I put my car." That behavioral choice to push through the gap using simple English they already know is what builds fluency.
That is a wonderful exercise for maintaining a conversation, but have you considered what is happening cognitively when they just label things in their room?
I think they're building immediate recall.
Not quite. Thinking native word for door equals English word for door is still translation. It is just happening at lightning speed. Environmental labeling of isolated nouns encourages the brain to store English words as direct equivalents to native words.
So how should they store them, in your view?
Real fluency requires building distinct semantic networks. If you want to stop translating, you have to break the L1 middleman entirely. You shouldn't think native word for food equals English word for food.
You need the concept.
Right. You need to feel the rumble in your stomach, the actual biological sensation of hunger, and map that directly to the English word food. It is a conceptual link, not a lexical one.
I completely agree that linking the physical sensation to the word is the goal. But how do you actually do that without the physical behavioral output I'm suggesting?
By changing the input.
But by saying, "I put on my shirt," every single morning as you are literally buttoning it, you are linking the English phrase directly to the tactile sensation of the plastic button and the action of your hands. You aren't translating. You are living it.
But living it requires more than single words or basic sentences. It requires embracing chunks.
Chunks?
Yes. The brain must learn natural phrase combinations, phrasal verbs, idioms, collocations. We shouldn't be learning the word depends and the word on separately. We should learn the entire chunk it depends on as a single unit of meaning.
Okay, I track with that.
If you isolate words, you encourage the brain to piece them back together using the grammar structures of your native language. That L1 grammar template is why intermediate learners often sound so unnatural, even when using the correct L2 vocabulary.
I see. So you're saying that if they learn it, depends, and on as separate files, they have to open 3 files and assemble them using their native language's instruction manual.
Exactly. Whereas if they've learned it depends on as one single file, it takes a fraction of the processing power, which leads us to the underlying structural logic of the language and the neurological reality of what it actually means to think in English.
Expand on that structural logic.
True bilingualism isn't just about swapping out vocabulary. It requires learning English social rules, cultural perspectives, and communication styles.
Give me an example of how a cultural perspective impacts the learner's brain at a structural level.
Well, let's look at metaphors for time. Mandarin uses both vertical and horizontal metaphors for time. They might conceptualize the past as being up and the future as being down.
Oh, fascinating.
Right? But English relies almost exclusively on horizontal metaphors. The past is behind us, we are looking forward to the future. Furthermore, English inherently favors a highly direct, linear, and goal-oriented style of communication. You state the thesis, then provide the evidence.
While other languages might circle the point.
Yes, many other languages build context first and only reveal the main point at the very end.
So a learner trying to use an English vocabulary word inside a native cultural framework is just going to hit a wall.
Exactly. To truly think in English, the learner has to adopt this mental flexibility. They have to put on their English personality. And we see the neurological results of this cognitive restructuring in the literature.
The brain changes.
Physically, individuals who actively manage 2 distinct linguistic and cultural frameworks physically increase the gray matter density in the areas of their brain that handle task switching and executive focus. It is a profound structural change. The brain physically alters its shape to accommodate this new operating system.
Well, I certainly agree on the neurological benefits. In fact, looking at the source material, there is a comprehensive meta-analysis of over 2,900 participants demonstrating that bilinguals have a significantly greater working memory capacity, and with a highly notable effect size, too.
Right.
But here's where we diverge on the mechanism. That executive function, that literal thickening of the gray matter, is developed specifically through the active, behavioral act of code switching and daily use.
Wait, you think the physical output creates the gray matter?
I do. When you force your brain to suppress your native L1 to output English, it acts like a cognitive weightlifting routine. You are stressing the executive control center of your brain.
I see the analogy, but
Thinking in English actually reduces emotional bias and creates psychological distance, making decision-making more logical. But this cognitive upgrade isn't accessed by passively reading or mapping concepts in your head. It is accessed through daily behavioral choices.
like what?
It happens when a learner sits down at night and writes a simple 3-sentence diary in English. It happens when they practice imaginary conversations, playing both sides of an argument out loud while waiting for the bus. It is the output that drives the neuroplasticity.
I come at it from a completely different way. The output is the symptom of the neuroplasticity, not the sole cause.
The symptom?
Yes, if you are writing a 3-sentence diary, but you are still conceptualizing those sentences in your native language and then writing them in English, you are not reaping those cognitive benefits. You are just performing a very exhausting translation exercise. To get the reduced emotional bias and the psychological distance, you must be engaging in direct conceptual encoding.
Meaning what, practically?
Meaning the brain has to evaluate the context, access the vocabulary, and adjust the tone without the native language acting as a middleman. If you are just doing a slow, written translation in a diary, you are keeping the middleman employed.
But you cannot eliminate the middleman without forcing the brain into a position where the middleman is simply too slow to be useful.
And that's where we disagree.
That is why time pressure exercises and speaking out loud are so vital. When you are forcing yourself to respond to a podcast in real time or shadowing a rapid speaker, the L1 middleman simply cannot keep up. The brain is incredibly efficient.
Sure, it is efficient.
When it realizes that translation is too slow to achieve the behavioral goal, which is speaking right now, it drops the translation and starts grasping directly for the English concepts.
Efficiency is exactly my point, though. The brain drops translation when it has a robust, chunk-based network of English concepts to fall back on.
Okay.
If that procedural network isn't there, the brain doesn't just magically find the English because you put it under time pressure, it freezes. That is the system crash. That is the moment of panic and anxiety we talked about at the very beginning of the show.
So you build the network through input.
Exactly. This is why I advocate for reading different types of English. Science, history, culture, and learning new words strictly through English-to-English dictionaries. You build a web of meaning entirely within the target language, so that when the time pressure hits, the L2 network is there to catch you.
You know, I think we have actually arrived at a very crucial point of convergence there.
Oh.
Yeah. Regardless of whether we prioritize the behavioral output or the cognitive input, we both unequivocally agree that the bilingual dictionary is the absolute enemy of the intermediate learner.
100%. Looking up a translation reinforces the exact neural pathway we are trying to prune. It strengthens the middleman. If you don't know a word, you must use English you already know to explain it, like your circumlocution example with the garage, or you must use an English-only dictionary to define it.
We also seem to agree that translation is an unsustainable cognitive bottleneck that completely overloads Baddeley's working memory model. You simply cannot juggle the L1 manual and ride the L2 bike at the same time.
Beautifully put.
And importantly, we both agree that perfection is not the goal. Whether you are shadowing a native speaker and mangling the vowels, or listening to a complex podcast at 1.25 speed and missing half the words, you do not need to understand 100% of what you hear to make profound progress.
Tolerating ambiguity is a massive part of the cognitive shift. You have to let the language wash over you and trust that your brain's pattern recognition software is working in the background, even when you feel totally lost.
So as we wrap up our discussion today, we might agree that the bilingual dictionary is the enemy, but I still fundamentally maintain that you cannot read or listen your way out of a speaking problem.
Fair enough.
For the intermediate student, the key to finally stopping that internal translation is relentless, low-stakes output. It is about shadowing, talking to yourself, describing your environment, and narrating your daily life until the brain's physical and habitual pathways default to English. You have to force the mouth to train the brain.
And I maintain that these behavioral habits will only get you so far if they are not underpinned by a fundamental cognitive shift. You can speak all day, but if you are just quickly mapping nouns to your native language, you will hit a ceiling.
You need the conceptual link.
You have to rewire the input to fix the output. You bypass the native language entirely by learning in functional chunks, focusing on direct concept-to-English mapping, like linking hunger directly to food, and embracing the unique, linear, structural logic of the English language.
Well, either way you approach it, it really is an incredible feat of neuroplasticity. Rewiring the adult brain to hold two distinct linguistic systems offers benefits that go so far beyond just speaking a language, from enhanced working memory to more logical, less emotionally biased decision-making.
It is a complete cognitive upgrade. But that upgrade only happens provided you are doing the hard work to truly think in the language, rather than just running a highly efficient mental translation software.
Which leaves us with a question for everyone listening, and a return to that out-of-sync movie we started with.
Yes.
Take a close look at your own daily study habits. When you sit down with your English materials today, are the techniques you are using actually helping you sync the audio perfectly to the picture? Or are they just teaching you to read the translated subtitles a little bit faster?
A question definitely worth considering for anyone stuck on that plateau.
Until next time, keep examining the evidence.